what I noticed on social media and a lot of the publicity that's happening at the moment is terminology greenwashing, where people are coming out saying, we're sustainable now, we're net zero, everything is CO2 neutral. We do only timber. We don't have any dirty materials in our buildings or what have you. And I find it really challenging because what companies are doing they're not really being honest, because no business is net zero. It can't be, simply because of the assets they own or the way they operate or what have you. And I do find that hugely challenging. And I don't know, being an expert in kind of this specialization within the sector of sustainability and timber, how do you guys deal with that? Is it something you just go, am I going to ignore that and not get involved in it? Or is it something that does annoy you from time to time if it comes across your desk?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we're all human. We all kind of find certain stories frustrating or disingenuous or whatever. But I think from my point of view, look, I mean, we can't allow perfection to be the enemy of the good. Yeah. We don't have time, right? So if we only say we will only build 100% timber buildings and they will be on, lime stabilized clay foundation, we can't. That isn't the answer. So I think maybe 15 years ago as a practice, a lot of what we did around making buildings that were as timbery as possible was really about proof of concept. It was about saying we need to explain to people that this is unambiguously possible. Dalston Works is a great example in that, which is 121 homes, 10 stories. At the time, the largest amount of CLT that had been used in a single building. And look, that proved the idea. But, in the last couple of months, we've had consent for a very substantial building over in the Olympic Legacy sites in Stratford. That's a steel and timber hybrid building. I think to us, the more carbon we can take out of the buildings we're making, the better. And look, at the end of the day, if people want to find ways to tell that story in order to demonstrate to stakeholders, to customers, that this is the thing that they should support, that unlocks some of those barriers for them, look, hey, you go tell that story. I'm not going to complain about that. So to us, it's always, every project we approach, it's what is the maximum impact we can make on delivering a sustainable building? And sometimes we win all of our arguments and sometimes not so many. But those buildings are getting built, when those clients come to us, someone's going to build that building. So what can we do? And, I'd encourage all the architects out there to do the same. It doesn't have to be about timber. What can you do to bring down that number?
And something on timber and it being such a beautiful product to work with, a material to work with, and it's in the interest in the industry increasing. What we're hearing a little bit about is timber being stamped as green, but not necessarily, or that timber coming from, I don't know, the rainforests, etc., in South America. How do we ensure that what we're building with is good, sustainable quality timber coming from good, sustainable quality supply, if you like?
Yeah. So there's some really, there's the obvious answers. Look, at the end of the day, when we procure our timber from the EU, we rely on schemes like PEFC and FSC to tell us about that. But, the next layer, I would say, we've talked to some of our kind of more blue chip clients, and they're very interested now in looking at the provenance of the timber and that supply chain. And I understand why they do that, because those big companies have found themselves reporting outcomes, and those outcomes have been undermined. And, it is clear that there will be people in supply chains that try to circumvent those processes. Now, I think as an industry, the timber industry is very good at saying, right, we've got work to do. We've got work to do on biodiversity. We've got work to do on the way that our glues perform and what's in those glues. We've got work to do on global supply chains and things like that. But again, this is where I come back to this idea of speaking with equivalency. For example, in a lot of the models we use to quantify our buildings, the transport of steel comes from the last person you buy it from, not where it was manufactured.
That's right. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So I am very happy to say we do lots and lots of that work. We have 3 research programs funded by the EU Horizon Fund. Some of those go out into biodiversity and supply chain. They also go into the future, into circularity and things like that. And I think the timber industry is pretty good from where it is today, acknowledging where it needs to be. Yeah. But again, it's this idea that what we want is well-sourced, sustainably delivered products across the supply chain. And until we acknowledge that steel that is made in China, brought to Europe and then sold from France to the UK has traveled a lot further than goes into our carbon assessments, then we're not really going to achieve what we need to by working out where that one tree came from in X building. Not to say in any way that it isn't important still.
something we've been talking about internally, myself and one of my colleagues, Roger, has been the impact of the rise of use of timber, cutting down really mature trees, the amount of carbon that those trees are able to consume each year. And then what's the sustainable solution when we cut down a tree of 10 or 20 or 30, 40 years old? By planting another tree, it's not an equal transition, right? Because a young tree doesn't take up as much carbon. So how are we dealing with that within the industry? Have you had any interface or experience in that?
We have, and I'll tell you what I've been told about those things. This is where the comment thread sort of goes wild and goes, oh, well, actually, this species. But, you know, from our understanding, well, the first thing to say is that the vast majority of forests in Europe are commercial forests. So they are planted for that purpose. So our starting point is that the livelihoods that rely on those forests, the management of those forests relies upon a onward kind of hinterland of where that timber is used. Now, from our point of view, that carbon stored in that 30 years of that Sitka spruce, we have choices about where that goes, right? So the average lifespan of a restaurant in London is 6 months. Most restaurants close after 6 months because of funding issues. Now, think of all that banquette seating made from OSB and chipboard and the bar front. All the wood that goes into those products, that's going back into the environment pretty quickly because that's going into the tip or wherever it's being chipped, used as biofuel as a best case, but that carbon's going out. Now, if we can take those trees that are being grown commercially for farming to be cut down and put them in locations where they can last for 60, 80, 100 years, that is success because that's when the replanting of 3 trees has a net positive or a net negative, if you want, effect on what we're trying to achieve. Again, I'm not an arboriculturalist. We're adjacent to this world. But the understanding that I've been given by the people we work with in that space is actually by far the greatest rate of absorption of CO2 happens in those first 30 years for those commercially grown, fast-growing softwoods. So actually, what we're doing is we're getting the most efficient use of that carbon-sucking machine. Then we're making sure that carbon stays in that machine in the most durable, long-lasting components. I've no doubt there will be a whole suite of arboriculturalists on the thread with lots more detailed knowledge than me.
Absolutely.
But this is how we explain to people what our process is. But I think one last point is, you know, the black and white building, which is a building that lots of people might be familiar with, that has around 1,750 trees in it of various species, mostly spruce, some beech, some tulip wood from the US. We did some maths with the suppliers to work out how much productive use comes out of a tree. What is your growing cycle? How many stems do you have in the Black Forest where most of that timber came from? And we reckon there's about 52 minutes worth of wood in there. If you think about the whole forest growing at the same time. So whilst I don't think we have the carrying capacity for every building in the world, we have the carrying capacity for a lot. And all those buildings that can be simply, efficiently made, saving the carbon for our soaring art gallery or whatever it might be, there's no reason we shouldn't be doing a lot more. And that will encourage sustainable and good quality forest management. It will support the kinds of research that we're doing to look at the use of less used species in order to biodiversify our forests. So I'm not going to say that all those problems have solutions today, but I think the journey...
You're working towards it, at least. Is the supply chain ready for kind of the use of mass timber in that way? Like, do we have enough manufacturers of CLT solutions and products and so on that allows us to build in mass, as you suggest?
Yeah, I mean... At the moment, those suppliers are near to the forests. You know, so certainly when we look at it from a UK or an Ireland perspective, we don't have native companies pressing CLT in any great volume. So that obviously is something that in the fullness of time we'd like to change. That requires useful commercial forests. I know in Ireland, people like Quilcher are working really hard on that. We have research grants with Forestry England to talk about how we use UK grown timber in those scenarios today. But, you know, I mean, when I look around, there are the names that people will know, the Binderholz, KLH, Stora. They already have an immense capacity. You know, in some of those businesses, they make and produce so many timber products. It's really about what they allocate to which factory. So the ability to increase production is high. But every week, I meet another company that has entered the market. You know, we currently have a very modest project in Portugal. And, you know, that caused us to go and have a little dive, see who's doing what. And we found 3 or 4 small manufacturers starting that journey of pressing CLT. So, you know, it's like when we asked the timber industry, is there an ecosystem for second life CLT when it comes out of the buildings? And the first answers we got, no, nobody will buy that. Nobody knows how to test it. And one said, no, if you can sell it, if there is, the market will provide. And, I'm no free market
sure.
liberalist, but at the end of the day, there is an economic case, and that is supported by the clear and obvious need.
Yeah.
So I have no doubts that industry will be able to deliver the things that
and
we
repurpose.
need.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yes, it is a very interesting that deconstruct and repurpose component end of life. Well, unfortunately, we might never see it, but nevertheless, that's what we need to plan for.